It's Ray, it's Jane. There is a new bill in Illinois, sponsored by Lillian Jimenez and Senator Mike Simons. Legislation it's tall, it's stout. It reforms the criminal legal system to require that judges not only view children as survivors of exploitation, but also considers their experiences. Now, what this boils down to is, let's say that somebody's in a sex traffic ring or somebody's in a bad situation. They do something to harm the person that's been harming them. Now they end up in front of a judge. They end up with an attorney. They end up in a court of law. And this bill will now protect them because of the harm that was done to them. To maybe get them out of that situation. So with that said right there, I want to bring in our next guest this morning. Yasmin Vafa is the co-founder of the Rights for Girls. Yasmin, welcome to WLS.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You know, we hear about sex trafficking all the time, and this has been going on for a long, long time. I think it was about 20 years ago I sat in a police conference where I first heard of this, and I was just like, wait, this can't, how can this happen in a suburb of Chicago? Can you just, dumb it down to the simplest form? What is sex trafficking that these girls and people go through?
Sure. I mean, I think, it's exactly what you describe. I think most people assume that it's something that's happening in other countries. It's something that if it's happening in the United States, is happening to, immigrants or foreign nationals. But the truth is the vast majority of those who are trafficked in the United States are American born, and 40% of them are children. We know that most of the children who are trafficked in the United States are American children. They are kids in foster care, runaway and homeless youth, and they're often children who were abused and incredibly vulnerable to begin with. So, these are some of the most vulnerable, wounded children who are falling through the cracks to begin with. So, traffickers target them for a reason. And I think people don't realize that they're, some of our most vulnerable and marginalized children.
It's important to talk about. Yasmin Vafa is here. She's the co-founder and executive director of rightsforgirls.org.
Yeah, Yasmin, the path from sexual abuse to prison is at an all-time high. So these, like you had just mentioned, the girls or boys who are victimized will end up in jail. Has that changed in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement or the Me Too movement or COVID over the last couple of years? Has that pathway changed, or has it increased because of the last several years?
We set out to find out that exact same thing. We published our first report, The Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, The Girls' Story, back in 2015 to expose the fact that so many girls, and especially girls of color across the country, were being criminalized because of the abuse that they experienced. And what we found was that across the country, about 73% of girls behind bars reported past histories of abuse before entering the system. But in some states, that was even higher. So in South Carolina, California, Oregon, it was upwards of 80%. And when we looked at those high rates of trauma together with the most common offenses for girls, it became clear they were being punished because of the abuse. So, for example, the most common offenses for girls were things like running away from home, prostitution, when we all know there's no such thing as a child prostitute. If children are too young to consent to sex, how are we incarcerating them and punishing them for prostitution? They're victims of child sex trafficking. So nevertheless, we were seeing these rates of abuse and incarceration. So fast forward to 2023, we wanted to see, has this changed? We've had these huge cultural moments with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Me Too movement, and certainly with COVID-19 and its impact on girls and women. And unfortunately, we saw that this is still happening, that girls and young women are being punished and falling through the cracks. And so we highlighted 3 new pathways for girls into the system. And one of them is girls who are sex trafficked, who are falling into the adult prison system for protecting themselves against their adult exploiters and their traffickers. And so that is the subject of this law that Illinois was able to pass and why it's so monumental.
Why do you think there certainly seems to be a stigmatism around talking about this and getting down and dirty with it because it's not romantic. It's no fun to talk about. Do you think movies like The Sound of Freedom and organizations like yours are doing justice to bringing this to the forefront where it really needs to be?
Well, I think, people maybe falsely assume that, if a victim is, harming their abuser in self-defense, then surely a judge or jury would be able to hear those facts and understand that background. But unfortunately, they're prohibited from hearing those facts because it's considered prejudicial. So, we know many survivors that have been sentenced when they were children, as adults, when they were, 15, 16, 17 years old, to decades, if not life in prison. Some of them were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for what amounts to acts of self-defense. And in those cases, the judges and juries were barred from hearing that the person that they harmed was their trafficker, that they had been trafficked by this person in some cases since they were 10 years old. And I think that the juries would have reacted very differently if they knew those facts. And so, that's why it's so critical to advocate to get bills like this introduced at the state level. And, we recently were able to get it introduced at the federal level to help lawmakers understand these realities.
We live our lives like this never could happen. My goodness, how could this go on in my neighborhood? But take some time today and log on to rightsforgirls.org and just give it 3 or 4 minutes that you might give to Instagram or Facebook because it's important. We're speaking with Yasmin Vafa. She is the co-founder and executive director of rightsforgirls.org.
And Yasmin, your organization, rightsforgirls.org, created a campaign that changes the laws, which is what we're talking about today, which changes the language, creates awareness about sex trafficking. Because again, like Ray said, we don't want to think about it. This doesn't happen, but it does. So tell us a little bit about the No Such Thing campaign and what that does.
Sure. So we launched this campaign in partnership with a survivor named T. Ortiz. And, she was so frustrated by the fact that in the media, in the press, in the public square, child victims were routinely referred to as child prostitutes, as child sex workers, when they didn't have the ability or agency to consent to sex, let alone commercial sex. And, she really felt strongly about this. And so, we wanted to challenge the media. We wanted to change the narrative around the demonization of these children and wanted to make clear that, there's no such thing as a child prostitute, that the term itself is an oxymoron, and that we really need to shift the way that we speak around this population, because what we say around the campaign is how we are named, is how we are treated. And so the power of language is really critical. When we talk about these children as prostitutes, it impacts how they are treated in the court system, by law enforcement, by judges, in schools, and in the hospital system. And so, talking about them as child victims, as, victims of crime, as survivors of abuse, of exploitation, as victims of human trafficking, it really shifts the paradigm and, makes clear that they are survivors in need of services and support. And that's a critical change that needs to happen.
It's a big topic. It needs to be talked about. Yasmin Vafa, we are going to put your website up on our socials, and we will post this interview up as well. What you're doing is very important work. We can find more information at rightsforgirls.org. I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you.
All right. You have a good day. Thank you.